All right, Daf Kuf Zayin, Shabbos is Daf. Let's pick it up from the bottom of Kuf Vav Amid Beis. Omar Rav, Naitel Adam es Shtei Yodav Shacharis. A person can wash his hands in the morning, Umasna Lein Kol Yom Kulei. And he could say, this should keep my hands tahar throughout the whole day. Make it Tanai that I can eat bread whenever I want throughout the whole day. Just from that one washing in the morning. I'll be careful not to touch anything tummy. Now Rashi speaks this out, that when a person's masna, they have to be careful that they shouldn't be matama their hands. But it sounds like from Rashi that you still have to make the Tanai, because you could l'chayr make a simple dig from Rashi, that why can't I just be careful not to touch anything tummy all day? Why does Rav have to say that Naitel Adam Shtei Yodav Shacharis Masna Alehen? So based on that, Dr. Rashba, you see from Rashi that your netila requires a kavana. And that's what we see from umasna, because the person has to have the intention to eat based on the washing. And the Ritzvah even puts a finer point on it, that if you're naitel yadayim without any kavana, you have to wash again. And even the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Kuf Nun Tes says, l'chadchila, you're supposed to have kavana for your washing. The Magen Avram goes so far to say it's makah b'diavad. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if a person goes ahead and washes without kavana, and then now decides to use that for hamaitzi, there's technically a suffix bracha at that point whether or not it'll work. So the poskim right, the best thing to do is to touch something that would force a new netila, so it won't be a bracha shein tzricha, and therefore you will have a new kavana dika netilas yadayim. Another issue to deal with L'gabe Rav's memory here is what Taisus talks about in the bottom Taisus, that we have this idea of takif, that right after a bracha you have to do the mitzvah. It's negated to a whole bunch of different halachas, but one of the things the Gemara in bracha says is takif l'netila seuda. So how can you go ahead and be masna for kol yom kulei? So Taisus himself brings from the Rabbeinu Tam that it makes a difference whether or not you're masna by shacharis. But the Rabbeinu Yoina, which is actually brought in Shulchan Aruch, says it makes a difference whether or not you're making the netila legabe a seuda or more stam. That if you're doing it for the seuda, then it needs to be takif. And the Rabbeinu Yoina is even brought lahalach in Kuf Samach Daled. All right, let's get back to Rav's memra. So you can be masna kol yom kulei, Amar Luhu Rav Avina libnei, moving over to Medalef, Pakta de Arvus, which was a location where there was a lack of water. Kegoinatun, delay shchichi luchumaya, like you, chevra in Pakta de Arvus, that you don't have much water. Mashu yadaychu b'tzafra, wash your hands in the morning. Va'asnu alayhu l'kul yom, make the t'nai that your hands should just stay tahar throughout the whole day. It's an eitzah to not have to use too much water. You could diamri b'shas hadchak in, it's only when you have a lack of water, but shalei b'shas hadchak lei. But if you got plenty of water, like generally with us, we have plenty of water, you can't just wash in the morning and have it cover you throughout the day. Upliga de Rav, and according to this kind of a lashon, then Rav Avina is arguing with Rav and saying you shouldn't do it unless you have a mamish asadchak. But if you get the amri afilu shleibish asadchak nami behind the Rav, and it's going like Rav. Omer of Papa, hi arisa didaloi. Let's say you have this kind of a irrigation system where there's a canal of water where they take the water from these different buckets and pour it into the ditch, and then it kind of moves into the fields. Okay, it's like a whole process for irrigation. So the question is, I want to use it for my netilas yadayim. So the halacha is, this arisa didaloi ain't naitlin mimenal yadayim. You shouldn't just stick your hands into this ditch and let the water rush over your hands. Why? Delay asumi kayach gavra. You need to have a kayach gavra for it to work. Now, even though the water in this ditch, it was poured in from buckets, but Rashi's lashon over here is there's no netila and there's no tevila. The netila, Zok Rashi, is the lav kayach gavra, also as the Gemara says. And tevila nami betziner lesa she'ein kan shir mikvah. Zok Rashi, you don't have our ba'im sa, you don't have a shir of a mikvah, so you can't do the tevila either. This Rashi does seem to be taking a very important stance on the issue of whether or not tevilas yadayim requires mayim that's not she'uvim or not. Because Rashi seems to only care about the shir, that you don't have the shir mikvah. Well, if you did have a shir mikvah, it would still be mayim she'uvim. It came out of a bucket. So it sounds like from Rashi that wouldn't matter. That is a major machlekes rishonim, and we'll leave it at that. But back to Rav Papa's memra of imakarav lagabe davla. Let's say he's close to where that water was coming out of the bucket. So now dekazumi kayach gavra will night limi menali yadayim. Now you can takadun netilas yadayim with that water. Vi bezia davla bekainis mashkan. Let's say that bucket has a hole in it, such that the water that flows into the pail through that hole and connects it to the water of that whole canal where the water is getting drawn. Then melev laifi umatbale esayadayim. So now the water that's already in that ditch is now connected to the other water, and therefore you can do a netilas yadayim, and therefore you can eat bread based on that netila. V'yomer Rava, another halacha, klisha nikib b'kainis mashka. Let's say you have a keli that has a hole in it, such that the mashka can go into it. Ein night limi menali yadayim. Because as Rashi says, once it's a klisha nikib, heisnish ken kli, lav kli huzak Rashi. V'yomer Rava, klisha ein b'revius. Let's say there's not a revius of water in the kli. Ein night limi menali yadayim. Is that true that you need to have a whole revius? I've omer Rava, klisha ein machzik revius. Let's say a keli doesn't even hold a revius. Ein night limi menali yadayim. But it sounds like homagzik if the size of the kli is big enough to hold a revius. Alphagav de lespe, even if there's not enough liquid in it, but lamaisa it's still gonna be okay, even though it's not a revius. Ha lechad, where do you need to have a revius? That's when one person is washing. But ha letrei, if two people are washing, even if there's not enough to have a revius for both of them, then it will be okay. De'tanan, as the Mishnah in Masechta Yadayim says, May revius neitlin liyadayim lo'echad v'afilu lishnayim. That same revius can work for both people. Omer le Rav Sheshes la'meimar kabdisu amona. Are you makbid that you have to have a keli? Omer le in. I am. Ach azusa. How about the tsura of the water that has to look like water? Omer le in. How about ashiura? How about the amount of water? Does it need to be revius? Omer le in. But there's another lashon of how the conversation went. Hachi Omer le. This is what a meimer said to Rav Sheshes. Amona v'achazusa kabdinan. You're only makbid about the tsura of the keli and the water, but ashiura loy kapdinan. De'etnan, because the Mishnah, as we quoted before, says may revius neitlin liyadayim le'echad v'afilu lishnaim. But v'loihi, it's not really correct to be medayik that way from the Mishnah that you don't need a revius, because shani hasam mishum dekasum mishiari tahara. In the case of the Mishnah, the reason why you need less than a revius because the second person was getting shiuri tahara, and therefore it's not the pshat that you never needed a revius. There was a revius for that first person. Asking Rav Yaakov bin Arpakaid natla bas revisa, that Rav Yaakov bin Arpakaid made a revius sized keli to be the standard that he can therefore measure how much you need for netilas yadayim. Asking Rav Ashi b'Hutzel kuza bas reviasa, he made a revius sized kli cheres in Hutzel, also to use as the measuring standard. V'yamar Rava migufas chavis shetikna. Let's say you have a cover of a barrel that you carved a hole in it, so there's a clay cable neitlin mimenu yadayim. You can actually use it for netilas yadayim. That's how Rashi understands it. Taisus has a problem with that because lamaisa it's a clay cable, so obviously it's kosher for netilas yadayim. So he says maybe it's because maybe the bump out will cause it that you can't set down the kli, and therefore it would tip to one side and spill out what's inside. So that's the question of whether or not it's going to be kosher for netilas yadayim. Tandi nami hachi megufas chavis shetikna neitlin mimenu yadayim chemes ukefisha shetikna. And also these other kinds of flasks made out of skins are also going to be okay for netilas yadayim. These things are all neitlin mimenu yadayim. But sakva kupa, which is not going to be sturdy enough to hold the water, afal pisha makablim, even though they now temporarily can hold water, a neitlin mehem liyadayim, they are not good for netilas yadayim. This, of course, is a very big modern day issue when it comes to disposable stuff. There's an oft quoted Rav Moshe Feinstein in Arachaim Gimel Lamed Test that he wrote that you can't use these paper cups that are disposable because, as the Gemara says here, you can't use the sakva kupa. However, Rav Moshe wrote the tshuva in 1968 when Dixie cups were very flimsy. Rav Asher Weiss and other poskim say that, of course, if Rav Moshe would take a look at the very sturdy kind of disposable items that we have today, he may not say the same halacha. So even though it's popularly quoted as disposable, cups are no good, it's not so pashut that's what Rav Moshe meant. Iboilhu, mahu lechel mappa. Let's say I don't want to touch the bread because I don't want to wash my hands, so I'll just cover it with a napkin, right? All of our kids learned this in elementary school at one point or another, that as long as you don't touch the bread, you don't have to wash. Not so simple. So the Gemara has the shaila itself. Are we afraid that maybe he's going to touch the bread with his hands and therefore it's going to be usher to eat without washing? Oi, loy, or maybe not. Toshma. We'll bring a raya from the Mishnah in Sukkah, because the Mishnah says when they gave Reb Tzadok smaller than the size of a beya's worth of food, so what did he do? He ate it inside of a mappa, outside of the sukkah. And he didn't bench after he ate it. There's a whole bunch of important halachas to learn from Reb Tzadok, but for our purposes, my lav ha kebeya boy netilas yadayim. It sounds like only because he ate less than a beya, that's why he didn't have netilas yadayim. And it's mashma that had he eaten a kebeya size, he would have needed a netilas yadayim, and it wouldn't have been good enough just because he was eating with a mappa. But Zok the Gemara, it's nishkein raya because dilma ha kebeya by sukkah by bracha. Maybe the reason why the Mishnah was talking about that he ate less than a beya was not also the halacha of netilas yadayim, but it was also the halacha of sukkah and bracha. So Tashma, let's bring a raya from another story. De Shmuel ashkache l'Rav de ka'achal b'mappa. Shmuel found Rav eating one time with his hands, but he had a mappa separating the bread from his fingers, right? So Amar le, so Shmuel, turning over Talmud Beis, Avdin Kedain, is this an appropriate way to do? Amar le, Zok Rav, don't bring any rise from what I'm saying because daiti kitsara alai. I taka did do netilas yadayim, and the only reason I'm holding the bread with this mappa is not because of a halacha, but because I'm daiti kitsara. I don't want to touch the food with my hands myself. This is a good story to quote next time you go to a falafel shop and they put the falafel inside of the paper sleeve. It's not the pshat that you're being such a frumak or some halachic reason. You don't want to touch the bread because you're going to get the trina and the hummus and your chips and your charif all over your hands. Kisolok Rabbi Zera, Ashkechinu l'Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Asi daka'achli b'vavloi chamasais. He found Rav Ami and Rav Asi eating this bread with these worn out flasks around their hands like gloves, and they didn't wash their hands. So Amar Zok Reb Zera, Trei Gavri Raver ve'kavosaichu litu b'derav Shmuel. Two Greisa Talmidei Chacham should make a mistake. L'gabe that story about Rav and Shmuel. You think Rav was eating because his hands were unwashed? Hadaiti katsara kamer. The Rav himself said the reason why he was using the covers on his hands is because daiti katsara, but not because he didn't wash his hands. Ishtamitze hada omer of Tachlifa bar Avimi omer Shmuel. But Lamaisa Reb Zera forgot that which Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi said b'shem Shmuel. that Hitir b'mapel oichle truma, that Rabbanan were taka mekel for those who would eat truma, because as Rashi says, the Kaihanim are reason and they're not going to touch the bread. V'lo Hitir b'mapel oichle taras, but they were not matter eating any achila al yedei mappa for just people who wanted to eat b'tahara, meaning chulin b'tahara. For Rabbi Ami, for Rabbi Yasi, Kaihanim have, and therefore that's why it was okay for them. Now, bottom line, lahalacha, it is brought in Shulchan Aruch that you don't have to wash if you cover the bread, but you have to be rochik dalid mil. You got to be very far away from the opportunity for water. So next time your kids say, I don't have to wash because I'm going to not touch the bread, yeah, sure, if there's no water around within dalid mil, which is a shayla b'zman as to how to even equate that, because we can travel faster than they used to do back in the days. So is it the distance that you could go on a train, or is it walking specifically? But either way, it's going to be a substantial amount of time that you wouldn't be able to find water nearby. Back to the Gemara. Let somebody who's being fed food. Because Lamais is not touching it. So Tashima, to Rav Huna bar Schaira, have a kai kamei de Rav Hamnuna. Bolam le umtza, and he roasted a meat for him in the coals and put it together with his bread and put it into Rav Hamnuna's mouth. Va'achal, and Rav Hamnuna ate it. Amar le zok Rav Huna bar Schaira. Ilav de Rav Hamnuna. Had you not been Rav Hamnuna, lesafinolach, I wouldn't feed you, because as Rashi says, you didn't wash your hands. So my timer, what do you mean because he's Rav Huna? Lab mishum de zohar v'lenaga. Isn't it because he's saying, if it wouldn't be for the fact that you're Rav Hamnuna, who's so makbid not to touch the bread with your hands? So vice dice, someone who's being fed by somebody else is not mechuyev to wash his hands. To which the Gemara says, loy, even if you're being fed by somebody else, you got to wash your hands. But Rav Hamnuna was just being soymech dezaris kadamu mashi yadei mikar, that Rav Hamnuna, who was Rav Hamnuna, must have already washed his hands. That's what he assumes. Tashma, di omer Rabbi Zera omer Rav, lo yitei nadam prusa l'seich piv shel shamush. You can't put a piece of bread into the mouth of your shamish, into the waiter, ela imkin yodei bay shenat yadav, unless you know that the waiter already washed his hands. V'hashamish mevarech al kol kais v'kais, and also, incidentally, the shamish has to make a bracha on every different kais of wine that he's being given to drink, because we have to assume there's a hesach hadas. Ve'eno mevarech al kol prusa, but you don't make a bracha on every piece of bread that he's given to eat, because he's going to assume he's going to be eating more bread. So it's considered one long maisa of achila. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, mevarech al kol prusa prusa. So Rabbi Yochanan argues, says that he has to make another bracha on every piece of bread. So Omar Papa, Bishlema de Rav for Rabbi Yochanan like kasha. There's no steer between Rav, that the shamish does not make a bracha on every piece of bread, and Rabbi Yochanan, who says he does make a bracha on every piece of bread, because hadika adam chashiv, where there's an adam chashiv at the seuda, and therefore the waiter can assume that the Talmud Chacham is going to offer him food, and therefore he's not mesiach das from the bracha. But hadaleka adam chashiv, and therefore he doesn't know if he's going to get any more bread, and therefore he should make another bracha. Mikol makaim haka Amar, but Rav Lamaisa said, El im ken yodesh and natal yadav, unless we know that he already washed his hands. Vice dice, even a person who's being fed must wash his hands. To which the Gemara says it's not really a raya, because shani shamish to tarid. There's a specific halacha by a shamish, because he's so tarid, he might forget if he didn't wash his hands and touch the bread with his tamei hands. Tana Rabbanan, the Brisa says, Lo yitin adam prusa l'shamish, a person shouldn't give a piece of bread to the shamish, bein shakais biyadei, whether or not the shamish is still holding a kais, bein shakais biyadei shel balabayis. Why? Kashema ira davar kalkala basuda. We don't want to get the host distracted and make him choke on his drink. And the waiter who didn't wash his hands, you cannot feed him. So the Bryce is pretty clear, and for whatever reason the Gemara didn't want to bring this Bryce right off the bat as a clear raya. Michael, the person who's doing the feeding, does he require netilas yadayim? Not the guy who's eating it, but the guy who's doing the feeding. Toshma, Titani Debei Menashe, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Isha Medicha es Yada Achas B'mayim, a woman can wash one hand with water on Yom Kippur, v'neisenes pas libna katan, and she can now feed that bread to her little b'na katan who can eat on Yom Kippur. Omru alav al shamai hazaken, shalei rotzel lahachal b'yodei achas, he didn't want to feed his child even with one hand, v'gazru alav sheyechel b'shtei yodav. And his colleagues said that he should wash and feed with two hands. Don't think that Shammai hazaken was going to starve his child, it was just not to feed him bread. But l'maisa, you do have a raya that you got to wash your hands, even doing the feeding. Omru Rabaya, hasam mishum meshivta. The reason why you're washing hands is not because of the netilas yadayim, it's because of the ruach ra on your hands after a night. Tashma, de'avur de Shmuel ashkechel Shmuel de kabachi. One time, Shmuel's father found little Shmuel crying. Omar le, he said to him, Mein Kind, amai kabachis, why are you crying? Zok Shmuel, de machin rabbi, because my Rebbe hit me. Amai, his father asked. Zok Shmuel, de Omar li kosofis levroi, v'le moshes yodach. Shmuel says, because the Rebbe told me to feed his own kid, and the Rebbe hit me because you fed my son and you didn't wash your hands. So Shmuel's father said, V'amai le moshes, and why taka didn't you wash your hands? So Omar le zok Shmuel to his father, because hu achol v'ano mashina, he's eating and I should wash. Omar le zok tavu de Shmuel, le mistaya de le gomer mimcha nami mochi. It's not enough that the Rebbe didn't even know the halachas of netilas yadayim, that he's not mechuyev to wash his hands, but he hits my kid as well. V'hilchasa, oichel machot Michael, someone who's eating as a result of somebody feeding him, tzarech netilas yadayim, but Michael, the actual feeder, einoi tzarech netilas yadayim, does not need to wash his hands. We'll stop here and pick it up with the Mishnah for Sunday's daf.